Welcome back, everyone, to Sunday School. We are in week 3 of Discipleship 101. As you know, I am team teaching with Pastor Clay and Frank. And the first week, Pastor Clay explained really the case for discipleship, why it's vital to our individual growth in Christ, and why it's really vital to our church community that we corporately also grow in our faith with purpose and direction. And so Clay really addressed a lot of that in the first week. And then Frank addressed well the goal of discipleship, what it would look like to grow in our journey, in our character development, in Christ-like character development. And so starting this week, we're going to get into some practical steps. We started with big picture, now we're going to get in somewhat specific practical steps. Starting this week with what it means to know your sheep. We'll get into know your sheep and feed your sheep and protect your sheep. And there's another one in there as well. And so, of course, sheep, shepherding is synonymous in a lot of ways with discipleship. And so as Jesus, the good shepherd, disciples us, he shepherds us, he leads us, we are his sheep. And in a sense, when you are discipling, purposefully leading others in their journey, in a sense, you are shepherding them, and so they are, in a sense, your sheep. So today we're going to look at what does that mean to really kind of know this person you are leading. Always fascinated when Christ would engage with people, he would always address the core things in their heart, whether it was the woman at the well, when she highlighted the fact that he, a Jew, would ask a Samaritan woman for a drink, and he instead went right after the core of her heart, saying, if you knew who it was that asked you, you'd be asking him for a drink. Knowing that her heart needed and had an ache in there that she was not engaging with. And so in a lot of ways, we need to be thinking likewise that effective discipleship must engage core issues of the heart. And Christ would engage it because he knew the heart. And so every time he gave encouragement or an admonition, it was always going to hit the mark because he always knew the heart that he was engaging with. One of my favorite verses is Proverbs 25. It tells us that the purposes of a person's heart are deep waters, but the one who has insight draws them out. Deep waters are murky, fluid, hard to grasp, much like a person's heart. And so when we are taking on what is a very honorable but weighty position, responsibility of leading somebody in their journey, their heart is deep waters. And so in order for us to engage well, it really starts with our ability to even know their heart. So how do you get to know someone, especially in the context of discipleship? So in week 1, Pastor Clay gave us our working definition of discipleship, that it's a lifelong devotion to our own Christ-like transformational work that God is doing in us, which compels us to joyfully invest in the transformative work of God in others. I know, it's a mouthful. But the key phrase here is our joyful investment in others. So as we start to dig into some of these practical applications of discipleship, we are digging into what it means to invest. If you were going to invest your hard-earned money into a company through the stock market, what is the first thing you're going to do? You're going to research the company. You're going to get to know it. You need to know this company if you are going to invest something of you into that company. You need to know the company. Well, in a similar way, if we're going to invest in people, invest in their journey, really a core beginning place to start is, I got to know you. I need to understand who you are, who this person is that is sitting before me as I'm engaging with you day in and day out, week after week, walking alongside you in your journey as I walk in my own journey. It starts with, I need to get to know you. Some of the phrases that Paul would say is, make my joy complete, being like-minded, and that we are fellow workers for your joy. That Paul had the notion of his investment into people had a dividend that returned to him. And that dividend, in a lot of ways, was their spiritual growth. And so we want to be thinking about discipleship as a personal investment into the life of somebody else. And so part of the way to start doing that is I have to know something of who you are. And kind of back to our questions. So how do we know? How do we get to know somebody, especially in the context of discipleship and in discipling somebody? Well, I would say that to know somebody well starts with listening well. To know somebody well starts with listening well. Listening requires us to hear something more than just information. We listen to connect and to understand. I can know information about somebody. I can know if they're married and how many kids they have and what job they do. And it's information. It gives me something about them, but it doesn't really connect me in a deeper way. And so this question is, how do you get to know somebody? Well, if I'm going to listen well, how do I listen well? And I really kind of want to spend the majority of our time this morning looking at how do I listen well? Because if I do that, I'm going to get to know somebody. I think one of our biggest hurdles in general as people that are eager to connect, one of our biggest hurdles is how we listen well. Oftentimes when we are connecting with people, I think our tendency is to hear them and try to bring their story, their situation, and relate it to our situation. Imagine there was this 20-foot rope that connected you with the other person. And intimacy and getting to know them means we need to be close, and we're not close, we're 20 feet apart. I think oftentimes when we engage with people, it kind of feels like we're pulling the rope and pulling them to our world, our understanding, our way of thinking. And sometimes when we do that, in our eagerness to connect, it sometimes creates poor connection. In our eagerness to understand them, we try to draw them into our world. It's sort of like when they share a story about their life, and you can tend to respond with, I went through something similar like that, and I understand what you're going through. And while it's certainly a form of connection, it may not be the best form. In the words of my father, don't let the good rob you of the best. It's a good effort to connect that way, but I think there's a better way to connect. And so as we think about connecting and understanding and listening to know somebody, we need to, instead of trying to bring them into our world, we need to immerse ourselves into their world. So kind of back to the rope analogy, I'm not going to pull you to me. I may let the rope guide me as I move towards you, as I try to understand your world and immerse into your life. And so really getting to know the person you're discipling, and the ability to invest in them really means you are listening well by immersing yourself into their story. And so how do we do this? How do we listen well and immerse ourselves in their story? Well, I would say it starts with our need to be fully present as we engage with them. And in order to be fully present, we kind of need to turn the volume down on our noise, our internal noise. We all have noise. Our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings, our interactions with people. Our brain is really making neural connections all the time. It's always working. And so there's a lot of noise that happens in our head really all the time. And while we really can't shut it off, nor should we, when we really wanted to connect with somebody else, when I'm sitting with somebody and I want to immerse into their life, their story, understanding them, I have to turn my noise down. If it's too noisy, I can't really hear their noise, and I need to be able to hear their noise. And so there are a few things that can kind of get in the way, and there can be some noise that we have, even as a discipler, that we need to be aware of and try to turn down the volume. So the first of those would be anxiety. Anxiety can definitely be noise, and anxiety can kind of take various forms. Sometimes we're anxious because if we're meeting with somebody, when they're talking, we're already kind of thinking about how are we going to respond? What do they need from me? Especially in a disciple relationship. I think for the discipler, the one who is identified as leading this journey, you can really tend to take a lot of weight and feel a lot of responsibility. Like, I need to make sure that I'm leading. I have good answers. I know where I'm taking them. And oftentimes that can make a lot of noise in our heads. So much so that even when somebody's sharing, we're kind of already thinking about, how am I going to respond? What am I going to have to offer to them? How am I going to help them solve their dilemma if it's a dilemma? How am I going to help them work through a bad habit if it's a struggle they have in their life? And nothing hinders actually good connection more than when somebody is talking and they can see your wheels are spinning in your head. You're not really paying attention to them. You kind of are, but you're really actually thinking about, what am I going to say next? And so that's an anxiety, a worry, a weight that you can hold on to. It makes a lot of noise, but it's your noise, and you got to be able to turn that down. Anger can be a noise, and anger, again, can take various forms. It can be really irate, but oftentimes it can be more of just a mild frustration. It might not even be anything to do with the relationship or interaction you're having with the disciple. It may even just be things that are in your life that you're dealing with that can create some level of turmoil. Then again, it might be also some frustration as you are working with somebody. Maybe they seem to be stuck in what they're dealing with, or perhaps it can feel like they're not really engaging wholeheartedly in the issues of their life. And so it can tend to leave you feeling like they're not really doing the work, and that can make you angry and frustrated, and because you really want them to make some movement. And so sometimes when they're sharing, you can have some noise in your head that you really want to see some movement, and in that, it can distract you. Arrogance can be another noise we have. So anxiety, anger, and arrogance. And sometimes we feel like we already kind of know what they need to hear. And so sometimes we can be quick to give a response, to give an answer to a situation. Sometimes we're quick to say, I get what their issue is, and we kind of wrap it up, bookend it, and determine that this is the dilemma, and here's what I do, here's how I would solve that, here's how I would handle that. And the truth is, even if you can relate in very similar ways to somebody else's story, their story isn't your story. And their strengths, their weaknesses, the way they view and handle things can be significantly different than yours. And, admittedly, there have been many times when my first reaction is to sort of sum up what they're saying and to feel like, I know what you need to hear. And it was a wrong reaction. I had a wrong judgment call on it. And so I have learned how to, instead of being quick to jump into that, even if I feel like I get a sense of what's going on for them, I still want to ask more questions, because I don't want to be too quick to determine what that is. I don't want to let my noise, my own arrogance, my own certainty of what's happening, I don't want to let that do damage and cause damage. And so those are just three of what I would kind of say can be typical noises going on in our head. There can be other noises. We can be distracted in ways and bothered and There can be certain tendencies we experience while we're interacting with people. Sometimes, like I said, we feel anxious. Sometimes we feel bored. Sometimes we feel irritated. Sometimes we're completely distracted and or feel overwhelmed by all the information they're giving us. And for the most part, that will tend to be our noise. But like I said, not everything is necessarily about our noise. I didn't say to shut it off, turn it down the volume on your noise, because there are times when you are experiencing something and the noise that you feel that you're experiencing inside may actually give you some insight into who they are. Um, in other words, you might feel some angst. Maybe it's because they're anxious. Maybe they're anxious because it's hard for them to open up and share. Maybe they're anxious because they already feel pretty ashamed of their struggle and their sin. And I'm a believer, I shouldn't have this issue. And so that can feel shaming and they can feel anxious. And so you can sense some of that anxiety. Maybe some of the frustration you feel is because you get a sense that they're not really letting you in. And so they're kind of blocking something that they're there to get help, but they may block and not really let themselves be that vulnerable to you. And so that can tend to create some frustration. You may feel bored because they're kind of giving you, I guess what I would call anecdotal information. They may tell you about their job. They may tell you about that they shot a 87 the last golf score and the last time they were out on the course, and it's something about them, but it's not really deep, personal core elements to who they are, and so you can get bored with that. And so sometimes the bored feeling is actually because they're not really giving you something in a deeper way about who they are. So to sum that up, turn down your noise, but know that there's some noise you hear that might be something about what they're dealing with as well. So how do we engage well? How do we learn to listen well? What are some of the characteristics of listening well? And so let me name a few of them for you. The first one is anticipation. So really, when somebody is sitting before you and they start to share and open up about who they are, their life is a story. Your life is a story. That how we understand what happens in our life, there's a beginning, middle, and end to it. And so our lives are a story. So listening well can start with what you anticipate. What am I hoping, looking for? What does that look like? So imagine that if you were sitting and watching a movie, there are a few things that I would say you're already anticipating with regard to the movie. First, you're wanting to know who is the main hero or heroine that I am going to identify with. Who am I going to connect to in this story? Well, when you're sitting with somebody, you kind of already know who that is. It's them. And how am I going to connect to their story? How am I going to engage? And I have to connect to you if I'm going to root for you. And if I'm even more so going to walk alongside you, invest in your life, there's got to be something that I'm gripped to that's in you. So I'm anticipating that I would be compelled by your story. We watch movies to be drawn in, to be compelled by them. And so what we first do when we watch a movie is we're looking for who's the main character. And generally we already know if we've seen a commercial for it or whatever, and we kind of know who the main characters are, but it's not just the actor, it's who is this character? How am I going to connect to you? How am I going to care and root for you? Secondly, I'm also wondering, where are you going to struggle? So I'm anticipating that you have struggle in your life, that you have difficulties, things that you are going through, you are wrestling with. And so I want to try to connect to that. And then third, I'm wondering what redemption is going to look like in your story. And we'll talk a little bit in a little bit further in our Sunday school class here about looking at God's redemptive elements in our story. But I would say when we anticipate in talking to somebody, we're kind of looking for those categories. Where do you have stuff in your life that I'm going to care about and root for you, what's the struggle look like? And what would redemption, even if it's one category, what would redemption look like if you're struggling with an addiction, or you're struggling to really get into the word, or struggling in your prayer life? What would redemption look like in those categories? And so that's that first piece. If I'm listening with the anticipation of, I expect to be compelled by you. I expect that your story, whatever you're going through, has got great weight to it, and it matters, and I want to hear it. So I'm listening with anticipation. Second, I'm listening with humility. What I'm about to engage with, when you share, especially if you're going to be really open, it's sacred, it's holy, it's the utmost dignity of the soul. That when we're talking about discipleship that is real, solid, core issue discipleship, we're talking about vulnerable dignity of the soul. It's that place where maybe not too many people are led into that part of your world. And so to get to know you means I know something of the deeper core issues of who you are. And so humility says, hey, that's sacred. That really matters. Even if what you share is a lot of struggle or sin patterns in your life, there's even still a sacredness in that. Not that we should ever glorify sin, but you as a person are struggling through that. And that's worth holding with honor and dignity. And so, and then the other piece to humility is, I don't walk in your shoes. Even if I've experienced similar things, it's your story, and your story is distinctively different from mine. And so I hold it, it's from a place of humility that says it's worth hearing. Your story is worth hearing and wrestling with, and your life is worth engaging with and walking alongside with and investing in. All these kind of phrases we use kind of mean the same thing. It's like, it's this sense of committed discipleship and what that looks like. Third is the quality of being aware. We kind of talked about that already, of being fully present, that I'm going to be very aware of the noise in my that I'm experiencing, but I'm also going to be fully aware of what am I sensing from you? Are you fidgeting when you're sitting there? Are your words kind of rushed? Are you giving me a lot of information? Are you giving me a lot of information that doesn't really tell me a whole lot about you? Are you telling me stories as though you kind of have everything already figured out, and it seems like you don't really want much help or input? Like, I need to be aware and be listening for some of that kind of stuff, because I may not hear it directly in your words, and I might get a feel for that. And the more I'm aware of what's going on, the more that I can be kind of attuned to what's happening as we interact. The fourth characteristic is integrity. As I engage with you, I need to be honest about my own reactions internally. Like I talked about earlier, am I bored? Am I anxious? Am I irritated? Am I compelled? Am I intrigued? What am I feeling inside? Because whatever I'm feeling might kind of lead into a next question, a direction. When you share something, does it grip me? If not, why not? If I'm bored, maybe it's because you're not giving me much about you, or maybe my heart really isn't into this. I need to be bathing in prayer then, like, Lord, give me a heart that actually wants to connect. Far too often, and you can probably all give witness to this, we can have a lot of interactions that are just sort of transitional, superficial, surface, like where they're pleasant enough, but they're not really the kind of interaction that says I go away being affected, encouraged, changed, challenged, compelled. And so integrity says I want to matter, and I want you to matter. And so when I interact with you, if I'm not feeling that, integrity says I got to own that, and I need to try to do something to move myself and move this conversation out of that place if that's not happening. And then the last one is curiosity. Explore, explore, explore. I can't stress enough so often, like I said earlier, we want to try to connect, and we're eager to connect so the other knows that we care about them, and and so that we feel like we're joined in this journey with them, and so we're trying so hard to connect. Listen, hear this. If you are curious about them, you are connecting in a tremendous way. When you are curious about somebody else's journey, story, why does that thing bother them? Why do they feel that way? How do they feel about that? When you just want to know and want to know more, it is a tremendous reflection of a way of honoring them and that they feel honored. And so your curiosity is connecting. Even if all you're doing feels like I'm asking more questions and I feel like I may be even monopolizing their time, but even in discipleship, if there's that kind of exploration, we feel honored when somebody really wants to know. Sometimes it's a little unnerving if they ask personal questions, but the truth is we're really honored when they seem to be sincerely interested in who we are and how we think about the things that are happening in our life. And so curiosity is actually a tremendous way to establish, maintain connection. So now that we've kind of give some characteristics of what that looks like and how to turn down our noise and how to have sort of the characteristics of what to listen and how to listen, I want to look at two final pieces that look at what am I listening for? If I really want to connect and want to know somebody, what am I listening for? Well, as we already established, you're listening to story. Even if it's just a one-time story, if it's a pattern of struggle, that's still story. You're listening to their words, and as they share it, you're really listening to story. And so, two things I want to look for when I'm listening. First, I want to listen with anticipation to hear what turns out to be everyone's story in their story. And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. But we want to listen. When I listen to somebody, I'm listening for what is everybody's story within that story. There's certain themes, characteristics that we all have. I'm listening for what theirs is like, the flavor of these same categories in their life. And then secondly, I'm listening with a sense of wonder to hear God's redemptive story in their story. And I'll go into more detail about that. So the first one, listening with an anticipation to hear everyone's story within the story. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at a few scripture passages to kind of get a sense of this. Genesis 2:24 and 25. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united with his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were both naked and felt no shame. So a first beginning established place is that there's a naked and unashamed, and they're in the image of God. That's the beginning point of all of our stories. And so when I listen to somebody's story, I'm listening for where do I get the sense of this established longing for connection and intimacy that has vulnerability to it? Where do I listen for their dignity in a sense where they are made in the image of God? But then the fall happens. So Genesis chapter 3, verses 8 through 12. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man, "Where are you?" He answered, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." And he said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" The man said, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree, and I ate it." So 2 points to highlight here that are foundational in everybody's story. First, we were originally created and designed for intimacy. And even after the fall, intimacy is still a longing and desire within each person. And so when I'm engaging with anybody at any time, anywhere, I know that they have in themselves a extremely deep longing to be connected, to matter, to feel like they matter. Two elements in intimacy, belonging and impact. How am I going to belong, have a sense of value, purpose, unified with you? And how am I going to impact where you impact me and I impact you? Distinctiveness. So there's this unity and distinctiveness that we all have and we all long for. And so it started in innocence, but even after the fall, there was still desire for connection. But as you can hear, what does Adam first do when he's confronted? He blames Eve. And so we start with this sense of dignity and longing, but then we have divisiveness, that he's ready to blame her. And all of a sudden, what was unified, naked and unashamed, now becomes blaming and ashamed. Because again, Adam says, I heard you in the garden. So the presence of holiness, of God, the presence of holiness, but I was afraid, fear, because I was naked, exposed, so I hid. And so longing for intimacy, there's the dignity elements in us, and yet responding with depravity when we're exposed, either our own failure or the failure of others upon us. And so those themes are what is in everybody's story. And so when I sit and listen to somebody, and in my effort to get to know them, even though their story has a different flavor than mine, we have that in common, those elements in there. Another passage, Romans 8:19 through 23. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. And so in that passage, you have quite a few things in the passage. I want to highlight a few. Number one is we were subjected to frustration because otherwise we wouldn't seek the Lord out. So our depravity tends to be our effort to be self-sufficient, which usually has us hiding like Adam or blaming like Adam. We want to blame others. We don't want to take responsibility. And we want to hide. We don't want our sin exposed. And so this depravity piece is in there. And yet there's also this dignity side that says, but I groan inwardly, I long. We perpetually long for heaven. We were designed for heaven. We perpetually long for it. And so when I sit and listen with somebody, and when you decide to engage in discipleship with people, it's so important to know that these two themes are going on. Listening for dignity and listening for depravity. Where do you hear deep longing? Even longing for heaven can look like a longing for healthy relationships here. Couples get married because they long for that level of connection and intimacy. Where's that longing? How do you listen for that as you hear their story? But where do you also hear the pain of how they handle life and how they deal with it and how they become kind of self-sufficient? It's kind of like we come into the world with a big cup that says, fill into my life and I want to pour into your life. But Proverbs says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. So somewhere along the line in their story, if I hope to have my thirst quenched by relationship, by connection, but it gets deferred, it gets set aside for whatever reason, the busyness of life or the dysfunctions that we all kind of can struggle with in various ways, it makes for disappointment. So sometimes we put the big cup down and we get a smaller cup, and that smaller cup says, I'm just not going to hunger or long for as much. And so there's something of the depravity in our hearts that say we can tend to diminish what we long for, but we can't extinguish it because, like Romans says, we long for, in a deep way, we groan inwardly. And so we are meant to engage with that. And so as you listen and engage with people and you get to know somebody, you're listening for their dignity and you're listening for their depravity. And that is in everybody's story, whoever you are interacting with. So that's the first one, where you're listening for everyone's story in their story. And then secondly, you're looking for God's story in their story. You're looking for God's sovereign and redemptive work in their story. And I use the word wonder. You are listening with a sense of wonder. I think of wonder as is that idea of it's that curious thought in the back of your head. It doesn't mean you're quick to resolve or to say, here's what God's doing in your life. While we know that God is always up to redemptive work and that God doesn't waste anything, even our sin, he doesn't waste to do his sanctifying work in us. We know that that's true. But honestly, I don't know how he's doing it in your life. I don't know specifically what he's doing. And it can be a foolish notion to think that we know exactly how God is doing redemptive work, how and when and where and what he's using and how he's doing it. We know it's in there, but we should really, as we listen to people, wonder about it, not be too quick to determine what that is. And so that, I think back to the Westminster Catechism, that the first question, what is the chief end of man? To glorify God and enjoy him forever. That theme, if that's the chief end of our life, then it's got to be in our story. And so when somebody shares, I'm listening to their story and I'm wondering whether or not they see that. And I'm wondering, as I hear maybe pain that has been caused upon them, or I'm listening to their own struggles or the futility of they seem to keep giving in to this same kind of struggle of sin. I listen and wonder what God might be up to in the midst of that. The Bible is filled with stories about people that we see perhaps early on in their turmoil or blindedness. God is still doing something in their life. God is shaping and forming and using that. I remember hearing R.C. Sproul talk a little bit about the Apostle Paul. Before he was Paul, when he was Saul, he was so entrenched in theological studies. And Sproul said that pretty much before Jesus got a hold of Paul, Paul had already done the equivalent of 2 doctorate degrees in theology. He'd done that much study. Well, obviously, we know the end of that story, so we can see something of what God was doing, even when God did not yet intervene when Paul was persecuting the Lord's people, that the Lord did not immediately or supernaturally intervene in that for a time. It's a amazing, overwhelming kind of thought to think of what God is up to. But like that situation, nobody would know that about Paul on the front end of that. And so we should not hear people's stories and think that we know what's happening, but we should wonder about what God is up to. We should be maybe like Mary, who pondered all these things in her heart that the Lord had said and what she experienced from him. And it's this quiet curiosity. It does not mean there isn't a point where you explore that with the person, but it starts with wondering yourself. You're listening with that kind of mindset to say, I wonder how God might use this pain or this failure or this ongoing futile sort of struggle that they're in. I wonder what God may be doing with that. And so as we listen, we want to listen for that and listen for what might be themes in their story, and to think in terms of how God might use that, like he turned Saul to Paul, or that he allowed Joseph to go what he went through, so that Joseph in the end could say, like we should all be able to say, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. So there's that wraps up our third week of Discipleship 101. Hope that is helpful. And we will have some discussion questions for you on the screen and following. So have a good day.